The FIA has just announced that the dismissal of Christian Horner was illegal. Stay until the end only if you want to know the clause that was breached and the massive penalty that must be paid. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. The Formula One community has been hurled into absolute chaos, shaken to its very core, following an explosive declaration from the FIA that has blindsided both insiders and fans alike. In a ruling that could alter the very structure of team governance across the paddock for years to come, the FIA has determined that Red Bull Racing's high-profile and controversial termination of Christian Horner was not merely hasty or marred by procedural oversights, it was outright unlawful, breaching multiple employment protections and contractual safeguards that were supposed to serve as a fail-safe for executive leadership. The repercussions are nothing short of earth-shattering. After an exhaustive internal review conducted in absolute secrecy over the past several weeks, during which key testimonies were quietly collected, internal emails examined, and legal precedents dissected, the FIA's legal task force has now come forward with its final verdict. The result? A monumental $40 million sanction slapped on Red Bull Racing, half of which is to be paid directly to Christian Horner as both compensatory and punitive damages. This amount isn't just a fine, it's a resounding statement from motorsport's governing body, an unambiguous message that no team, no matter how successful or powerful, is above the framework of legality and ethical employment practices. The FIA's decision marks an unprecedented moment in F1's modern era, one where internal team politics, boardroom power struggles, and intergenerational tensions have spilled violently into public view. Sources close to the investigation have revealed that the catalyst for this implosion centers around a confidential clause buried deep within Horner's long-term executive contract, Clause 17.4b, a legal safeguard drafted during a critical renegotiation phase in late 2021. This clause, aptly titled Executive Accountability Protection, was engineered to function as a legal shield for Horner, stipulating that any attempt to remove him from his post as team principal must first undergo an impartial arbitration process. That process would have involved third-party legal experts, performance auditors, and contractual ethics consultants to determine whether Horner's actions had demonstrably harmed the team's brand integrity or competitive performance. Only if such a conclusion was reached could the dismissal be validated. However, in a stunning act of defiance, or perhaps desperation, Red Bull's upper echelon reportedly bypassed this essential clause. Internal documents indicate that a secretive emergency meeting was convened, prompted by rising friction not only within the management structure but also with the Verstappen camp. Tensions between Horner and Max Verstappen, compounded by the aggressive involvement of Jos Verstappen behind the scenes, are said to have escalated into outright hostility. According to insiders, Jos exerted immense pressure on Red Bull's executive leadership, framing Horner as a divisive influence and questioning his long-term suitability for guiding the team through what is expected to be a radically transformative period in Formula One's next engine era. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. That pressure culminated in a decisive internal vote to terminate Horner's contract, an action carried out with alarming speed and an apparent disregard for the binding arbitration procedure outlined in the contract. What's more shocking is that during this critical vote, 3 high-ranking executives, all of whom hold long-standing ties to Horner and a deep understanding of the contractual risks involved, chose to abstain entirely, citing legal and ethical reservations. Their abstention was viewed not as neutrality but as silent protest, and now, in hindsight, as a red flag that something deeply irregular was taking place behind closed doors. The FIA's report, though not released in full to the public, has been described by those briefed on it as damning and utterly scathing. It accuses Red Bull Racing of undermining foundational employment principles, failing to uphold contractual obligations, and setting a dangerous precedent that could destabilize executive structures across the sport. The governing body's legal department reportedly highlighted multiple instances where Red Bull's legal advisors either misrepresented the implications of Clause 17.4b or failed to escalate concerns up the proper compliance channels. These oversights, or deliberate acts of concealment, have now become the focal point of a parallel investigation into corporate malpractice within the organization. As for Christian Horner, sources close to the former team boss suggest he is both vindicated and deeply wounded. The financial compensation, amounting to $20 million, pales in comparison to the reputational repair now required after weeks of speculation, tabloid rumors, and an abrupt removal that left many questioning his legacy. Horner, who has been at the helm of Red Bull Racing since its inception, guiding the team through its most dominant eras and cultivating a powerhouse that rivaled even Mercedes' golden run, is now positioned not as a fallen titan, but as a wronged architect of success. His next moves are already fueling intense speculation, Will he return to the paddock with a rival team? Could he take on a senior role within FOM or the FIA itself? Or will he retreat entirely from the sport, choosing dignity over vengeance? In the wake of this scandal, the FIA's ruling has triggered cascading effects throughout the sport. Team principals are reportedly reviewing their own executive protections, legal teams are scrambling to reassess internal dismissal protocols, and at least 2 other major constructors are said to be considering revisions to their employment clauses to avoid a similar legal catastrophe. The message is clear: the days of backroom dismissals and politically driven power plays are under threat. The balance of power within Formula One has shifted, not just on the grid but deep within the glass-walled boardrooms where real battles are often fought. And this is far from over. With potential appeals, further disclosures, and the looming possibility of Horner returning to the sport in a different capacity, the motorsport world is holding its breath. Red Bull Racing now faces not just a financial penalty, but an existential one. The brand has taken a hit, its internal culture laid bare, its leadership questioned. The fallout from this scandal will likely ripple far beyond the current season, reshaping relationships, altering power dynamics, and perhaps, just perhaps, ushering in a new era of transparency and accountability in a sport where secrecy has too often reigned supreme. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. The findings by the FIA's independent arbitration panel shook the foundations of the Formula One paddock, unveiling a storm of procedural negligence and internal turmoil that many suspected but few could confirm, until now. Their report didn't just highlight a technical breach of Clause 17.4b, it exposed a complete disregard for the formalities required before any dismissal could be legally and ethically justified. The mandated 60-day resolution period, an essential buffer meant to allow for constructive dialogue and potential reconciliation, was blatantly ignored. That procedural lapse alone rendered the entire termination effort deeply flawed, yet the justification used by Red Bull to forcibly oust Christian Horner only compounded the controversy. Executives within the organization attempted to argue that his continued presence was creating team disharmony and triggering a loss of driver confidence. But those terms, once examined by the arbitration board, were torn apart for their vagueness, their reliance on subjective impressions rather than concrete documentation, and for being more reflective of political maneuvering than any measurable decline in leadership efficacy. What made the situation even more combustible was the irony of the accusations. While Horner was being framed as a destabilizing force, he had, by all measurable outcomes, succeeded in guiding Red Bull through one of the most turbulent seasons in its history while maintaining performance excellence, championship momentum, and relative on-track dominance amidst a hurricane of internal infighting and external media pressure. Yet behind that corporate facade of strategic management and podium finishes, the team was fracturing from within, and the epicenter of the quake was none other than Max Verstappen. Tensions between Horner and Verstappen had been quietly simmering for months, occasionally bubbling to the surface through cryptic press conference remarks and carefully leaked insider whispers. But what had previously been interpreted as harmless friction between a team principal and a star driver escalated dramatically when it was revealed that Verstappen had reportedly drawn a line in the sand during a private high-stakes meeting with Red Bull's senior leadership. According to multiple sources close to the situation, Verstappen issued a stark ultimatum: either Horner leaves, or he begins serious negotiations with rival teams, most notably Mercedes, who have long been circling the Dutch driver like sharks scenting blood in the water. That threat was not taken lightly. Verstappen holds immense value, both commercially and competitively. The prospect of losing him would be catastrophic. And so began the rapid unraveling of a relationship once thought to be unbreakable. But the real bombshell came in the form of leaked audio from a private meeting that took place just days before Horner was officially terminated. In that recording, Horner didn't hold back. In a voice brimming with controlled rage and personal betrayal, he confronted Verstappen directly, laying bare the web of power games and psychological warfare that had been quietly corroding the team from the inside. "Let's not pretend, Max," Horner said with piercing clarity. "This is all you're doing. Every ounce of this chaos is rooted in your ego and your father's whispers behind the scenes. You wanted full control. You've got it. But don't act like this is about performance. This is about dominance, and you've let it go to your head." It was a moment of brutal honesty, the kind that rarely escapes the sealed vaults of Formula One's most protected inner sanctums. Horner's words landed like a gut punch, exposing what many had speculated for years, that Jos Verstappen's influence was growing unchecked, and that Max, emboldened by years of winning and surrounded by a bubble of yes-men, was no longer just a driver but a political operator with an insatiable hunger for absolute authority. Verstappen's reply was immediate and volcanic. Furious and visibly shaken, he fired back with accusations of his own, leveling a series of harsh indictments against Horner's leadership. He accused the team principal of sabotaging the team spirit, claiming that Horner's obsession with control and image had alienated not just the drivers, but also key members of the technical staff. "You don't have our trust anymore," Verstappen reportedly said, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and finality. "You've turned this team into your personal PR machine. You care more about headlines than harmony, more about appearances than performance." The verbal sparring spiraled into chaos, with raised voices echoing through the meeting room, alliances fracturing in real time, and an eerie silence falling over the rest of the team's senior management, who seemed paralyzed between loyalty, fear, and pragmatism. The meeting ended in absolute disarray. No consensus, no peace, no handshake. Just two titanic egos clashing in a space too small to contain them, their collision shaking the very structure of Red Bull racing. What followed was a week of veiled statements, media spin, and frantic damage control. But behind the scenes, the wheels of Horner's removal had already been set in motion. Despite the arbitration panel's findings now suggesting that his dismissal was mishandled and unjustified, the real decision had already been made, not in a boardroom, but in the shifting power dynamics between a driver who believes he is the team and a leader unwilling to be reduced to a supporting character in someone else's empire. The fallout from this saga will be felt for seasons to come. What began as an internal disagreement has morphed into a civil war with implications stretching far beyond the confines of the Red Bull garage. The FIA's findings may vindicate Horner on paper, but in the real world of paddock politics, perception often outweighs truth. And right now, the perception is that Red Bull is no longer unified. It's fractured, vulnerable, and teetering on the edge of a power struggle that threatens to engulf its legacy and its future all at once. Behind the scenes, a storm had been brewing for months. One that the public never fully saw coming, and that insiders now describe as one of the most explosive and calculated takedowns in the history of the sport. Jos Verstappen, far from being a mere background figure in his son's meteoric career, was actively and relentlessly working behind the curtain, crafting a narrative and lobbying tirelessly to reshape the very foundation of Red Bull Racing's leadership. According to multiple confidential sources who spoke under condition of anonymity, Jos had been systematically applying pressure on Helmut Marko and other top-level executives within Red Bull's internal power structure. He allegedly painted a compelling yet sharply critical picture of Christian Horner, arguing not just that the team principal had outlived his usefulness, but that he had become a liability to the evolving strategic direction Red Bull intended to pursue in the upcoming seasons. In private meetings that reportedly took place in hotel suites, private clubs, and encrypted digital calls, Jos pushed the idea that Horner's values, methods, and decision-making no longer aligned with what Red Bull's elite stakeholders saw as the vision for the next chapter, one defined by precision, innovation, and total unity between driver, team, and corporate leadership. There was talk, whispers at first, then increasingly bold conversations, that Horner had become disconnected, that his leadership style clashed with a younger, more aggressive culture Red Bull was cultivating, particularly with Max Verstappen as the central figure of the team's global brand. Sources claim Jos didn't stop at words. He took action. He quietly began consulting with legal advisors, engaging some of the most discreet but powerful sports contract attorneys in Europe, seeking their opinion on whether there was any pathway to terminate Horner's position without triggering the multi-million-dollar severance clause embedded deep within his contract. These discussions were said to be exploratory at first, but they grew in intensity and frequency as tensions within the team escalated. According to internal reports and FIA reviews that would later emerge, Jos and his circle were actively probing loopholes in the contract language, especially those surrounding performance metrics, fiduciary duty, and conduct clauses. Their objective, sources insist, was to build a credible case for just cause, something that would legally allow Red Bull to circumvent the costly penalty of a full executive buyout. However, the FIA later concluded that the nature and manner in which this legal strategy was pursued demonstrated clear signs of bad faith, suggesting that the process was less about genuine concern for the team and more about orchestrating a swift political coup from within. But what truly sent shockwaves through the paddock was not just the planning, it was the speed and ruthlessness with which the plan was executed. Within a mere 48 hours of what insiders describe as a fiery confrontation between Horner and key figures at the highest level of Red Bull corporate leadership, the longtime team principal was not just dismissed, he was obliterated from the organization's ecosystem. He was reportedly summoned for a brief, highly controlled meeting at the Milton Keynes headquarters, during which he was informed that his services were no longer required. Witnesses say that no negotiation took place. No second chances were offered. There was no farewell or formal address to the team. Security personnel escorted him out of the building, and within hours, every trace of his access to internal systems, communications, and strategic files had been revoked. Perhaps even more controversial was the legal ambiguity of the move. According to FIA regulatory filings and compliance audits, Red Bull failed to honor Clause 19.6 of the Executive Level Operations Agreement, a clause that mandates a minimum of 30 days written notice prior to any reassignment or termination of an executive who holds protected status. The clause exists precisely to avoid impulsive or politically motivated firings at the highest level of motorsport organizations. Instead of adhering to this binding clause, Red Bull attempted to justify Horner's abrupt dismissal by citing vaguely defined immediate team requirements and emergency internal realignment, terms that, while dramatic in phrasing, hold no actual legal weight under current FIA governance frameworks, particularly when used to sidestep protections put in place for long-serving executives. The FIA, which has been increasingly concerned with the internal governance of teams following several recent controversies, viewed this breach as both alarming and precedent-setting. Officials within the organization were reportedly stunned by the audacity and procedural recklessness displayed, suggesting that Red Bull's leadership was either unaware of, or willfully dismissive toward, the formal processes required for executive termination. What emerged from this episode was not just the fall of a powerful figure, but the exposure of deep, unresolved fractures within the walls of one of Formula One's most dominant empires. A quiet war had been waged in secret, and when it ended, it left no doubt. This was not just a leadership change, it was a palace coup. Christian Horner, a name synonymous with Red Bull's meteoric rise in Formula One, has maintained a calculated public silence, offering almost nothing beyond the occasional guarded remark. But sources intimately familiar with the situation have painted a far more turbulent portrait of what's transpired behind closed doors. According to those in his inner circle, Horner feels deeply betrayed, not just by certain individuals within Red Bull's upper echelons, but by the very institution he helped build into a global powerhouse. He didn't see it coming. The decisions made behind his back, the sudden shift in loyalties, and the rapid escalation of internal conflict have left him not only blindsided, but grappling with a level of professional treachery few could endure. And yet, despite the storm that now surrounds him, he remains unbroken, strategically quiet, but legally and emotionally mobilized for war. Almost immediately after learning of the allegations and internal sabotage, Horner activated a high-powered legal team that began meticulously compiling counter-evidence. These weren't just vague claims or flimsy defenses. They presented a structured, aggressive legal strategy outlining numerous contract breaches, retaliatory actions from fellow executives, and deliberate acts of professional defamation designed to isolate and weaken him. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a takedown. Horner's team documented procedural failures, breaches of fiduciary responsibility, and what they labeled a malicious internal campaign to discredit the leadership structure that brought Red Bull its dominance. Word of the escalating internal battle leaked, spreading like wildfire through the paddock. Multiple team principals, some rivals of Horner, some uneasy allies, began to express their concerns privately to the FIA. There was a growing fear that if Red Bull's internal war became the new standard for how powerful teams resolve their internal disagreements, it could trigger chaos across the grid. This wasn't just about Red Bull anymore, it was about the future of the sport's governance and credibility. As the pressure mounted, the FIA was left with no choice but to intervene. What followed was a full-scale independent inquiry, authorized at the highest levels of the organization, and executed with a level of speed and depth that stunned many within the paddock. The report that emerged was not only explosive, it was damning. In addition to imposing a record-setting $40 million fine on Red Bull Racing, the FIA's judgment went further, demanding that the team comply with a series of invasive compliance audits to be conducted before the current season concludes. The message was crystal clear: cooperate fully, or face consequences far more severe. The potential for constructor point deductions, public sanctions, or even temporary suspensions looms large if Red Bull resists or fails to meet the FIA's benchmarks. The reputational damage alone could take years to reverse. But perhaps the most jaw-dropping revelation from the report was something no one could have anticipated. Buried within the lengthy legal summary was a section dedicated to what the FIA called willful tampering of internal documentation. Investigators found irrefutable proof that a high-ranking, unnamed member of Red Bull's board had deliberately altered digital timestamps on crucial internal communications. These alterations were designed to create the false narrative that Horner had failed to attend key strategic meetings and had repeatedly ignored escalating driver complaints, particularly those tied to Max Verstappen's increasingly unpredictable engineering demands and his obsession with fine-tuning telemetry to his personal driving style. The implication was that Horner had become disconnected from the team, disinterested in performance issues, and negligent in his duties. But digital forensics told a radically different story. The FIA's independent investigators, in collaboration with cyber forensic analysts, recovered data from backup servers that had been wiped in an apparent attempt to cover up the manipulation. The original metadata, once restored, revealed that Horner had not only attended the meetings in question, but had actively responded to the majority of driver concerns, often within minutes. His leadership, particularly during Verstappen's most erratic periods of demand and dissent, was clear and documented. The manipulation was not just unethical, it was deliberate, targeted, and likely criminal. This discovery detonated like a bomb across the sport. The paddock, already on edge, was thrown into a state of stunned disbelief. Within hours of the FIA's announcement, calls for resignations began to ripple through Red Bull's corporate structure. Sponsors reached out, demanding clarity and damage control. Meanwhile, fans around the world, many of whom had long admired Red Bull's aggressive, risk-taking ethos, began to question the integrity of the very team they idolized. What had once been seen as a bold culture of innovation now looked dangerously close to internal sabotage. Christian Horner, though still officially at the helm, now presides over a fractured empire. He's not just fighting for his career, he's fighting for the legacy he built, the trust he earned, and the truth that many tried to bury. While the full implications of the FIA's findings have yet to fully unravel, one thing is certain: this saga has redefined the limits of political warfare in Formula One. And in the eye of the storm stands Horner, betrayed, yes, ambushed, absolutely, but far from finished. As the embers of Red Bull's once glorious dominance flicker under the weight of internal chaos, the Formula One paddock finds itself grappling with a storm of revelations that have shattered the myth of stability inside the team. The collapse, though long whispered in hushed tones behind closed garage doors, has now burst into the spotlight in dramatic fashion. What once looked like an indomitable machine, a perfectly calibrated juggernaut with Max Verstappen at the helm, has been exposed as a fractured ecosystem, torn apart by egos, silent resentment, and power struggles that have brewed for far too long. Within this fractured empire, trust has decayed like rust beneath glossy paint. Several sources from within the team, including engineers who've been present since Red Bull's rise to power, have come forward in private circles to describe an atmosphere that has deteriorated into something nearly unrecognizable. Max got what he wanted, one senior engineer confessed under strict anonymity, but at what cost? He may have won the internal battle, but he destroyed the very foundation that made those victories possible. Christian wasn't just a team principal. He was the heartbeat, the moral compass, the steadying hand. You remove that, and all you're left with is chaos wrapped in carbon fiber. The emotional ripple effect is being felt across the Milton Keynes headquarters with unprecedented force. Team members, once fiercely loyal to the Red Bull project, are now packing their bags, both literally and figuratively. Some have handed in their resignation letters, citing not just disillusionment with management decisions, but a fundamental loss of identity. The sentiment is becoming increasingly common: this isn't the Red Bull they signed up for. This isn't the team that defied Mercedes, that outsmarted the paddock, that stood for unity, audacity, and innovation. The fallout goes far beyond just a managerial shift. It's a psychological earthquake. One highly respected aerodynamicist, known internally for leading some of the most groundbreaking concepts on the RB18 and RB19, offered a scathing perspective in an off-the-record conversation. Take away Horner, and you're not left with Red Bull. You're left with a marketing company with a steering wheel. You're left with Max Verstappen surrounded by yes-men, all too afraid to tell him when he's wrong, and none brave enough to lead. And Verstappen? His role in this implosion is no longer a whisper, it's becoming a roar. Insiders claim his increasing influence has created a toxic imbalance. What once was a symbiotic driver-team relationship has devolved into a monarchy, where disagreement is seen as betrayal and loyalty is rewarded only when it serves the crown. The paddock, always watchful, now murmurs about the long-term viability of this dynamic. Even rival team principals are reportedly baffled by Red Bull's willingness to bend the knee so completely to a single driver, even one as talented as Max. Meanwhile, Christian Horner is not retreating into silence. Far from it. Multiple legal sources suggest he is seriously contemplating taking action well beyond the scope of any internal FIA investigations. Reputational damages, targeted litigation in the UK High Court, and even broader corporate defamation cases are reportedly on the table. Those close to Horner say he's been approached by a number of outside entities, including high-profile figures in both motorsport and business sectors. The word is that he's in no rush, he's watching, calculating, and weighing his options. But make no mistake, the offers are flooding in. Among the most serious suitors are none other than Aston Martin and Audi. With the 2026 regulation overhaul looming ever closer, both manufacturers are keen to position themselves as major players in the next era of Formula One. And there's no denying the value someone like Horner brings, not just in terms of race strategy and leadership, but in organizational culture, talent retention, and media navigation. Sources within Audi's motorsport division have hinted that preliminary conversations have already taken place. At Aston Martin, senior board members are reportedly lobbying to secure a figurehead with the charisma, pedigree, and tenacity that Horner embodies. What's unfolding isn't just a rift within a team. It's the unraveling of an empire. Red Bull's pristine facade has been cracked open, revealing a volatile mix of ambition, betrayal, and unchecked power. In the process, the sport itself is being forced to confront deeper questions about loyalty, leadership, and what happens when a dynasty forgets the principles that built it. The story is still unfolding, but the sense is unmistakable. Formula One is witnessing not just the fall of a team dynamic, but perhaps the end of an era. The future of Red Bull racing stands at the edge of a precipice, with uncertainty gripping every corner of the paddock as the aftermath of a controversial and seismic internal shift continues to send shockwaves through the entire Formula One community. The air inside the Milton Keynes headquarters is thick with speculation, anxiety, and whispered doubts. And while Max Verstappen's contract technically binds him to the team until the end of the 2028 season, the reality unfolding behind the scenes may very well override the permanence of ink on paper. Those who know the inner workings of this high-octane world understand all too well that contracts are only as strong as the desire to stay. And that desire, according to several high-level insiders, may already be eroding in the face of what many are calling the most destabilizing moment in Red Bull's modern era. Max Verstappen, the ruthless competitor who redefined dominance across back-to-back championship seasons, now finds himself caught in a turbulent storm not of his making but one that threatens to engulf his ambitions. Loyalty has always been a delicate dance in Formula One, a sport where personal performance is paramount but the machinery, infrastructure, and leadership behind the scenes dictate whether a driver thrives or stalls. With Red Bull's long-standing leadership model appearing fractured and vulnerable, whispers have grown louder about potential escape routes, particularly the one potentially offered by Mercedes, a team that, despite recent setbacks, remains an iconic pillar of F1 success. The rumors surrounding Toto Wolff's alleged sabbatical have created a leadership vacuum that some believe could be filled with a bold new direction, perhaps one that starts by luring away the most successful driver of the modern era from a now-wounded rival. Verstappen's name, once synonymous with unshakable allegiance to Red Bull, has begun surfacing in hushed conversations among team principals, paddock insiders, and even rival engineers. The idea that the Dutch phenom could seriously entertain the notion of abandoning the team that helped sculpt his legend might have once seemed absurd. But not anymore. Not in this new landscape. Not in this unpredictable, drama-charged F1 season where everything, every relationship, every alliance, every hierarchy, is in flux. If Mercedes were to present a proposition laden with long-term stability, engineering excellence, and perhaps even the emotional appeal of restoring former glory, could Max say no? And if he were to say yes, how would Red Bull recover from not just the loss of a driver, but the shattering of an identity that revolved entirely around him? And then there's Christian Horner, the man at the center of the storm, the architect of Red Bull's rise, the tactician who has outlasted, outwitted, and outperformed rivals for nearly 2 decades. While some assumed that the recent legal and organizational quakes might bury his career under controversy and division, the opposite has happened. Against all odds, Horner is not receding into the shadows. Instead, he is charging back into the spotlight, not as a victim but as a strategist reborn. With a reported $20 million in damages awarded in his favor and an unexpected wave of support swelling behind him from across the paddock, Horner's influence appears to be growing, not shrinking. There's a renewed glint in his eye, not of vengeance, but of calculated resurgence. He's not interested in retreat. He's plotting, recalibrating, realigning his pieces on the F1 chessboard. In a sport where perception is power and silence can speak louder than press conferences, Horner's measured defiance and razor-sharp composure have left a lasting impression. Teams are watching. Drivers are intrigued. Sponsors are recalculating. The man many thought would be pushed out into the cold has instead emerged with the sympathy of fans, the quiet backing of key stakeholders, and the unmistakable aura of a man who has survived the worst and is now emboldened by it. Christian Horner isn't fading away, he's becoming mythic. He's transforming controversy into capital. And now, with the clarity of hindsight and the momentum of redemption driving him, he's preparing to re-enter the fight, not with desperation, but with a precise, almost surgical ferocity. This is no longer just about Red Bull's internal politics or Verstappen's loyalty or Mercedes' leadership vacuum. This is about legacy. This is about power. This is about a sport that thrives on reinvention, where the lines between hero and villain are always shifting, and where the next seismic move could come from anywhere. Christian Horner, far from being defeated, has positioned himself as a wild card in a game that no longer follows the old rules. Whether he returns at the helm of another team, establishes a new empire, or pulls strings from the shadows remains unknown. But make no mistake, the fire is back in his eyes, and Formula One will feel the heat of his return.